Working on the Riley again. I've been cleaning up and painting a few more of the pieces. So these are the rear hubs, or rather the things that the rear hubs bolt to, and the big lock nuts that go on the end of those. I just touched up the paint on one of the front hubs as well. The main thing I've been doing today is machining up the bushes for the universal joint. So these are the original bronze ones. And I suspect that this universal has actually was actually rebuilt and just not assembled, because it feels pretty solid. There's not a lot of movement in it as it is, compared to this other one that was on the spare car. You can see this one is pretty sloppy. So I'm going to go ahead and replace the bronze bushes with this modern engineering plastic. And what I've done so that I can machine these accurately is I ended up making a little, I guess you'd call it a mandrel, out of some steel. So this little piece of steel I turned up gives me the exact right length and more or less the right inside diameter for the bushes. And I have a large washer on the end and a bolt that sort of bolts it all together. And what I'm doing at the moment is I've just cut the little shoulder on here, because that needs to be accurately cut to eliminate the side-to-side play inside the U-joint. So with that cut, I can now machine this down to the correct outside diameter. And these need to be machined so that when they're in the housing, they get clamped up by the housing. But of course, you need the right clearance for the pins. And measuring this, it turns out these are 3/4 inch pins. And of course, I have a 3/4 inch reamer, which I just got to do the rear suspension. So my thinking is I've machined them so they're tight. At the moment, they're a tight fit on here. Apparently you want about 0.1 of a millimeter clearance inside there, because as this heats up, the plastic will expand a small amount. So my thinking is machine them up so they're a nice tight fit, assemble the whole thing without the input and the output things in there, and then ream through with the bushes in place, and then keep them in those positions from that point on once I've reamed them through. And I think that should give me the right sort of fit that I need for these things. But this plastic machines really easily, as you'd expect, because it is kind of a self-lubricating plastic, which is why I can use it. I finished machining the bushes. I ended up remaking 2 of them because I found they were still a little bit tight, and I thought I might have had the outside too fat, and when I was clamping it all up, it was compressing them and squashing them. So I machined a little bit off the outside, but I took too much, and then these ended up slightly loose in the housing, and you want them gripped by the housing. So I made 2 more, which didn't take me very long. Now I know how to do it, and I've assembled this. Everything moves freely without being sloppy, so there's no wobble in it. So I think that's all nice and good now. Of course, I can't bolt all this together permanently yet, because this side needs to go on the tail shaft of the gearbox, and there's basically it's a splined fitting. You can see the spline that has to go on, and then there is this nut that goes on the end. So what I need to do is this has to be taken apart again, and that will end up inside the housing on the rear of the gearbox. So I need to take all that off, and then I can get in there and paint it. I want to paint that rear gearbox housing. This thing here just needs a quick paint touch-up, and then the U-joint will go inside there. And I don't need to paint that because Basically, it's meant to be oiled from in here. Of course, you also need oil on the, not on the spline on the back here, but on this spline on the front of the prop shaft. This has to slide because of the up and down motion of the torque tube and the drive shaft inside it. So I'm assuming this one is sliding because also in the end here there's a hole and there's actually a pin and a spring, which is what's in this bag, so I don't lose it. So there's a spring inside there and a little pin to keep the tension on this. So I'm pretty sure this slides. You can see this one is a little bit pitted and worn, but it should be okay. So that will just get oil from here, which is also what oils this whole joint, torque tube joint. I'm guessing the problem with the universal joint bushes is trying to oil something that's spinning. So even if you put loads of oil in here and it's continually dripping on that universal joint, because the thing's spinning, it's going to fling all the oil out. So I imagine that's why they have problems with them not getting enough lubrication. And that's where the plastic helps, because the plastic is self-lubricating. It doesn't need extra lubrication, so that should be fine. But there should still be enough oil going down inside there to get into the sliding joints and the torque tube joint, hopefully. So I need to make a new leather gasket for this. That's one of those things I could cut on the laser cutter. And apparently there's meant to be a felt that goes in here that controls the rate of oil flow through this hole, because otherwise you would just fill this with oil, it's just going to pour out. So there's some sort of felt block that goes inside there. I think that's about it for today. I had to clean up the lathe. I just had enough plastic to do the job I needed to do because I had to remake those other two, but that should all be fine now. I do wonder if Loctite bearing fit would still work. If you were using the bronze ones, you could put a little bit of the bearing stuff on the outside there, the outside of the housing, and it just takes up any gaps and stops things rattling around. I'm assuming that wouldn't stick to the plastic, but it would still stick to the metal. So when I do the final assembly, it might be worth smearing a little bit of that in there, because you want the bush to be fixed in the housing and not rotate. It's the pin that rotates. So I'm quite pleased I got that small job done today. Just before I went in last night, I did remove the gearbox tail shaft housing. I'd completely forgotten that when you remove this, the whole shaft comes with it, because the bearing is pressed into this housing. So this is the output shaft of the gearbox, and having it apart actually makes it quite interesting to see how the gearbox works. So put that down. So inside the gearbox here, I currently have the back of the gearbox higher than the front, so this little lever here moves the reverse idler, which is that gear there, and you can see how normally it should be out of the way. So this is the input shaft of the gearbox. This is the lay shaft down the bottom. So as the input spins, the lay shaft always turns. The reverse gear shouldn't be turning, that should just be out of the way there, but it keeps sliding down the shaft. But you can sort of see how rotating the input rotates the rest of the gear cluster. And the output shaft, I'll put this somewhere safe. You can see this is a spline shaft. This gear runs separately. It's sort of, this isn't attached. So if you look at it, this gear spins freely on the shaft, and the shaft has these splines on it. So take that apart. This is the splined collar that slides onto this. So this goes down on there. Once you get the splines to line up. So that goes on there, and that can slide backwards and forwards, and this is moved by the selectors. So you can see the groove there, which is where the selector rod rotates. And sliding this back is what engages these dog teeth in here to send the drive from this helix gear into this shaft. So I think that's third gear. It gets confusing knowing which gear is which, but sliding that back engages with this, and that drives the output shaft. So if you imagine this is spinning, that's what engages this gear with the input shaft. And then there's a second cluster of gears that is splined to this set of splines. And you have to imagine that this is inside there, matching up with those two gears on the lay shaft. So either this set is engaged or that set is engaged. And that gives you two more gears. And then top gear, fourth, this comes forward and just engages directly with the output. And that just drives straight through. So there's not a lot to these gearboxes, these non-synchro ones. They're relatively straightforward and very robust. So you can see, get that back on there, there's not a lot to really go wrong with these. And so when people talk about crunching the gears, you're not actually... usually it's not the gears themselves that are crunching, although in this case it could be because of these middle gears. It's these dogs that engage. So it's sort of in here. But the other thing I did after painting this, I made sure the nut would go on the end, which is good. That's held with a pin. So what I can do is assemble the universal joint on here now and reassemble this gearbox, get it back together. So one interesting thing is I'm pretty sure the torque tube needs to be assembled to the rear axle housing as one piece, and you treat that as one piece, because it was very difficult for me to remove the torque tube without taking the rear axle off the spring mounts. In the end, what I did is I actually shifted the engine forwards, and then I was able to pull the torque tube out. So today I want to look at assembling the torque tube. I think I have all the parts for that, and possibly laser cutting the gaskets for the housing there. The other thing I did is I figured out where I was being daft on the rear cover bolts. These holes are threaded, which makes perfect sense. So there are bolts I need to get that go through the cover and into these tapped holes. I just didn't realize they were tapped holes. That's one of the disadvantages of painting everything this sort of satin finish black, is it makes it hard to see detail. And also my close-up vision is getting worse as I get older, so I'm now both short-sighted and nearsighted, which is a real pain in the neck. So I ran a tap through these holes to clean them up, and it makes it obvious that they're threaded holes. I just have a couple of studs in there at the moment to hold this on. So that's how the rear cover fits. This is the gearbox reassembled with the tailpiece on and all the gears back in place. One thing you have to remember when you assemble this is on the end of the shaft there's actually a ball bearing inside there. So I just checked and made sure that was still in there before I assembled it. And also you can't fit this gear cluster in through the back, so you have to hold that in the middle and then thread all of this through into it before it'll reassemble. But That seems to work fairly well. Although I think it'll go that way. Oh, that effectively just popped into neutral. But that's top gear there. I think neutral should be somewhere in there. Oh, the reverse gear slid forwards again. So I think something like that should be in neutral. There's enough drag on it that it's rotating. But the U-joint seems to move okay. That's all tidied up. So I may now look at reassembling the torque tube and checking in the manual or the book, the sort of one book we've got about these vintage Rileys. They talk about separating the rear axle casing from the end of the torque tube and the differential and everything going with this as a single unit. So I think the next thing I would have to do is assemble the torque tube and the differential. So I need to find the parts for those. I suspect I'm missing all the lock washers and things, so I'm going to have to order those before I can do much else. But another small step of progress, I guess. Just figuring out where to start. I've been doing lots of little bits and pieces again today. The gearbox, as I mentioned before, is the universal is all done now. And I also welded up the nut to the central mounting point for the gearbox, and then just gave it a coat of paint. I TIG welded it in the end. I had just enough gas left to do it, and then I just machined the weld just to tidy it up. And that's just to lock that nut onto there. I've started looking through some of the parts I've got and figuring out what I need. These are the rear hub seals, the modern replacement ones. This is the set of bearings for the torque tube and the rear axle. And I've been trying to figure out the rear axle parts I have. So this is a good second-hand differential, because I was completely missing that before, and a new crown wheel and pinion. So I do need to get the bolts and lock washers and all the bits and pieces that go with that. This is for the pinion gear. So this is where I'm struggling to remember what I've done before. This is the cleanest housing I've got, and I need to look at this because this is a little bit shorter than these other two. I think this one came in a box of bits, so that one's never been cleaned up. It needs degreasing and derusting so I can actually get it apart. So now I have to figure out which one is the right size housing that I need. Sort of doesn't really have any casting numbers or anything on it. And I'm trying to remember if this was a full one that I pulled apart, in which case where have I put the rest of the bits, because I'm going to need the nut. There's a nut down in here somewhere, various other bits and pieces that I'm going to need. These are the adjusters for the rear axle, so they should be fine. I might put those in the evaporust again just to make sure they're absolutely clean. I've repainted the rear axle ends and the nuts for those, but figuring out just this stuff, I need to keep going through my boxes of bits, because I'm sure I stripped this down and kept all the parts. So I have found bags and bags of old bearings, and I thought that it might be in here with some of these. That seems to be thrust bearings, because that does look like a lock washer, but I don't see unless that's it. This is the problem when a car takes you years to build, trying to remember what everything is, even when you label it. No, that's just one of the thrust bearings, old and rusty. More thrust bearing stuff. It's just another couple of bearings. Get more thrust washers and bearings. These don't look too bad. But I haven't found the nuts yet, so hopefully I've got those somewhere. I also started looking at fitting, this is the center bearing that the prop shaft runs in. This mounts sort of halfway down the torque tube inside there. There's two screws that hold it in place, which are down here. This one's got a little point to it, and I think what that is for is inside here there's a felt seal, and I'm pretty sure that screw is just to stop that felt seal from rotating. And then there's this steel washer there. You can see, I remember when I took this apart I had a real job getting it out, and I actually had a real job getting it back in. So I ended up just lightly machining it just to clean it up. And I also had to use a wire brush, a long extension, just to try and clean some of the rust out of there. And I finally managed to get this so it does slide in there. It's quite a tight fit, and when I knocked it back out, somewhere in there there's something that's catching, because you can see it scored a couple of gouges in there. So before I can fit this back in again, I need to get the O-ring that goes in that groove there. So that was another job I was hoping to get done, but realized I don't have the parts to finish. And then I also started looking at lapping in the valves into the new head, but then I remembered, well, I need to look at the valve guides. And the valve guides in the spare head were completely knackered, very, very loose. So I thought I'll take the guides out of the original head, because this was all supposed to be rebuilt, ready to go. But unfortunately I managed to break one of them. The shoulder snapped off it. And also I found this one looks like, this has all been obviously reused, so you can see it's been punched all the way around to make it a tight fit, which is kind of interesting. So now I have to decide, well, I might as well buy a new set of valve guides for it, because those are available. I think they're 12 or 13 pound each. But then what do I do about the valves? So I've actually been measuring up the valves I've got, and these are the inlet valves, and these are actually pretty good. I can't really measure any wear on it. Part of that's because I'm not very good at measuring, but I think I can reuse the inlet valves, but the exhaust valves, if we can look, have a bit more pitting around them. They're a bit more battered. This is the worst one. What's this one like? That's not too bad. So this is another one of these things where I'm never sure, well, what can you reuse? I'm sure these would work. I'm sure they would work fine. But is it worth replacing them, getting new ones? Because they're available as well. But then again, a new valve is about £20. So, you know, you're talking 160 quid just for a new set of valves, plus new guides to go with them. So it all kind of adds up pretty quickly, plus all the shipping from the UK, of course. So I'll decide what I'm going to do there. I do need to make another order anyway for all the lock washers and gaskets and bits and pieces. But that's one of the things when people talk about younger people getting into vintage cars. They can't afford the cars for a start, and even if people started leaving them the cars or you know, selling them to them cheaply, you still have to be able to afford the parts and the maintenance, and it's just unfortunately not cheap anymore. You know, even for me, with a good job, although we did buy a house this year, so that kind of takes care of a lot of the free money I had. But again, I'm slowly making progress. Half of it's just figuring out what I've got and what I need. I'll keep looking around for the other nuts and bolts and bits and pieces, but I knew where everything was before we moved, and just before moving, I sorted through everything, put it into different boxes, and then when we moved here, I've ended up putting it all on different shelving in different places. So the only way I really know what I've got is to go through every single box again, trying to find things. But like I say, those, I can't remember if this was just a spare housing. It may have just been a spare housing, and I never actually got around to stripping this down, although I'm sure I did. I'll probably have to look back through my old films and figure out if I've already taken one of those apart or not. I found them. They were in a different box up on the shelf. So usually when I clean this stuff up, I pick what I think looks like the best set of things and clean them up and put them away. So those are the nuts that should go on that pinion. These are quite interesting as well. So this is the little cap that goes in there. So that basically bolts onto there, and that pin is what locks onto the where have I put them? See, I'm already losing things. I've put those in the degreaser, and the other ones are in the evaporust. But you can see the little ridges on that. That pin is what locks into there, and that's what locks that pinion in place. So, but the interesting thing about these, somebody told me, I never realized, that number stamped on there is the diff ratio. So that one says 6:1. So I should have another one of these around somewhere. And I think the ratio I'm using is 5:1. I'd have to either count or look that up. But yeah, so that's where those went. I knew I had another one of those that I'd cleaned up. So you can see these kind of things get pretty chewed up when people don't have the right tools. So they use chisels and things to try and take them undone. So they get pretty mangled, which is kind of unfortunate. I don't know if maybe I could mill new slots. If it'll focus. Slots in the outside of there so the proper C-spanners will fit. Or can you sort of weld them up and then machine them back? I'm not sure. Or do you just think, well, since I'm only taking it apart and putting it together once, hopefully, do you just reuse them as they are? These can go back into the evaporust as well, just to clean the rust off them. That was the old Speedo drive that was on the original car, but the parts car has one of these gears that isn't completely worn out. And these are the brackets that go around the torque tube. That the brake cables, there's grommets that go through those little smaller holes, and that's what holds the brake cables and the handbrake rod. So I'll just put this back up on the shelf and probably promptly forget it's there, along with some other bits and pieces. But I think that was a reasonable weekend's progress on this.